I'm Doug Ammer. Um, I'm 76 years old. I live in just outside of Boise, Idaho. I actually was diagnosed with myelofibrosis when I was living in Pasco, Washington. Uh, when I look back on it, the thing that kind of sticks in my memory is that I noticed that, when I was mowing the lawn, I couldn't just go out and mow the lawn straight through. I always had to stop and take a one or two rests because I was getting exhausted. And I couldn't, at first, you don't really quite notice. But then after a while, it got to be a trend that I was doing that every time. And so I mentioned it to my doctor the next time I was in to him that I was having trouble with fatigue. So I can't remember what steps he went through with me, but it after two or three different things tries he ended up referring me to a hematologist. When I went to the hematologist in Richland, Washington, there uh, we went through a series of tests and ending up with a bone marrow biopsy. And that's where I got my diagnosis. That was in May of 2016. It took me a while to remember the name. When they call it a rare disease, you just don't know people that have myelofibrosis. It's not like breast cancer. Everybody knows somebody that had breast cancer. And so that's familiar. At that point in time, my disease was not that well, wasn't that far along, and so we just decided that what he called watchful waiting, that we just keep our eye on it for a time, because at the time there was only the one medication, jakafi, and and it was not a cure, uh, and as long as I didn't have symptoms that they were going to try to treat. We would just wait, and so that went on for probably the better part of a year. And in the middle of all that, we moved back to Boise here, and when I went to found a new hematologist here in town, he right away prescribed jakafi for me. So here we go. We go on jakafi, and I think I was a fairly typical patient with that. I went through a period of time where I had very low platelet counts. We had to keep adjusting my dosage because I was at one point in time I went well below 50, whatever the units are, and I was having trouble with and I also had anemia, and my anemia had gotten worse. One of the things I started doing early on after my diagnosis was doing a lot of reading. And, one of the things I did was I subscribed to Google Alerts, where you give it keywords and it combs through the internet looking for new articles that and sends you links to. And so, I was really not doing that well on Jakafi. I had a lot of fatigue. I felt like I was really just going downhill, and my platelet counts continued to be a problem. Lo and behold, there was a drug called selinexor, and they saw really good results in their clinical studies. And so they were ready to start a human trial. I read what they just, described in layman's terms, the drug and how it worked and what it did, this kind of thing. And it was interesting to me because number one, it was totally unique, completely different than jakafi, and it had been approved and was used as a third or fourth line treatment for multiple myeloma. So it actually was a drug that had an FDA approval that went with it. It was just a matter of trying to see if it had efficacy with my disease, with myelofibrosis. So I contacted them. There was a phone number, name and a phone number, and so they invited me down. Boise to Salt Lake is like a 6-hour drive. So I went down and they evaluated me, extended an offer, and said, yeah, I was definitely. The doctor said that he could tell that my spleen was large. I really didn't have that much information about my spleen at that point, but his take on the whole thing is that jakafi was not being effective for me, and the outward evidence was my enlarged spleen. I went through a period, and this was kind of an interesting part of the exercise, the fact that, oftentimes we hear people say things like you need to be your own advocate, when it comes to this. It not just up to the doctor, it's up to you to take care of things. I went back to my doctor here and said, hey, there's this drug trial going that they're starting down in Huntsman, and I've been invited in. What do you think? Well, he was really pretty cool to the idea, not enthusiastic. And so that kind of put me in a quandary, because I didn't want to get in a situation where I was running contrary to my doctor's advice. But, after a week or two went by, I got a call from the doctor down in Salt Lake, and he says, well, Doug, what are we going to do? Are you going to come on the program or not? Because I hadn't given them an answer. I said, well, and I explained to him about my doctor being reluctant about it. And he said, well, let me talk to him. So the two of them got together on the phone, and after their conversation, my doctor was enthusiastic about it. So I said, well, let's go do it. I had to get off of jakafi for a couple of weeks before I started on the trial. That was a real ordeal for me, because I just did it cold turkey, quit taking jakafi, and it was like it was the worst flu I ever had. I really felt bad for a couple of weeks. I felt like I was just sinking. But anyhow, I got through that, and right around mid-November, I started taking selinexor, and within a month or two, I was feeling the results of the drug, and it was all good. You know, and over a period of time, maybe over the first year, I wasn't keeping a journal or anything, but over time, my platelet counts started stabilizing and went up. Um, and then right along behind it, my hemoglobin was increasing. I was at the I think they have some unit of measure. I was at 7.8 on the hemoglobin scale, and my doctor told me that usually sometime when the patient was 7.5 or less was when they started doing transfusions, because a lot of myelofibrosis patients live on transfusions. So anyhow, I was steadily dropping down in getting closer to the territory where, where I would have to get transfusions. My blood count took off from 8.7, and over the period of a year or two, my blood counts are now 12.5. They're almost they're almost right at the low end of the normal range. So I've seen my platelets go square in they're in the 250 range. My hemoglobin is like I said, somewhere, it varies, but somewhere between 12 and 12 and a half. My white blood cell counts, that was one of the early indicators at the very beginning. My white blood cell counts were high. They were in the normal range, but they were in the high end of the range. And the doctor, for him, the thing that he noticed is that they were consistently high. It wasn't like because white blood cell counts vary quite a bit on normal people, because your body's fighting off an infection or something like that, and white blood cell counts go up. Well, mine were just always consistently always hanging up there in the high end of the range, and actually today they still are doing that. I never go into the out of the range, but the white blood cell counts for me are high. My anemia has, for all intents and purposes, been solved out of the 4 years I've been on the drug, for at least for the last two. When I do monthly blood draws consistently. My hemoglobin and my red blood cell counts are in the normal range. My white blood cell counts are on the high end of the normal range always, and my platelet counts are in the middle of the normal range. So I'm living, I had gotten to the point where, before I started the selinexor trial, where I had gone out and bought a walker. One of my doctors suggested, we were, I told her, because I was having so much trouble with fatigue, that I wasn't taking walks. I didn't want to get out on a walk somewhere and then just be totally exhausted. And she suggested I get a walker with a seat in it. And that way I could just pull up and park myself for a time and get my energy back. Well, that walker is sitting right next to me here, and I haven't used it ever since I started selinexor. I take selinexor is a once a week. I take two little pills. We've adjusted the dosage. I started out, when I first was on the trial, I was taking 80 milligrams. Now that the initial trial period is over, the doctor adjusted my dosage down to 40. The problem I have gotten into with selinexor is my appetite and my maintaining my weight. I've lost 85 or 90 pounds. That was over a period of a year or two, but still it was a significant weight loss. It was due almost entirely to the fact that selinexor just took away my appetite. And the doctor gave me different medicine to take, different pills to take, to try to counteract that problem. And I've been at this dosage level for a long time. I seem to be in a place where the good effects that I'm looking for from my drugs are it's still being effective. One of the things that I have to put up with is with the selinexor, it puts me in a mode where I kind of off. When I take the drug on Wednesday, it's usually Saturday or Sunday before I feel completely right again. I feel sometimes it's kind of like having the blues, you know. Sometimes it just has to be with not feeling quite good, quite right, but it's never intolerable. It isn't like I lay around and ride. There's no pain that goes along with it, but it is part of the what it takes to take selinexor is I have to put up with that. It always amazes me that myelofibrosis is they call it a rare disease. There aren't that many people that have it, but it just amazes me the amount of effort that the pharmaceutical community is putting into developing treatments for the drug. But I'm grateful for it. I'm all for it. If they're willing to go for it, I'm willing to be the guinea pig for them, I guess. It's one of the things that's kind of different about being on a drug trial. I think that there's a lot of safety, I guess, built into the process. You're not, you know, that's based on my experience. But my experience, I had the benefit of the fact that this drug had been tested for other cancers before it came to me. So some of the effects to where is this drug safe? Some of those questions had already been answered with other uh, drug trials that had gone on, and so I had the benefit of that on this trial. Made it a little bit easier for me to make a decision. But certainly, here again, you don't think that it's dangerous and you're out there all by yourself or something like that. There's a whole network of people that are supporting and running these programs that are really quite knowledgeable, and they certainly have a vested interest in not having failure. They don't want to have a failure in me any more than I want one. I was the fourth person on the trial, and so there's really nobody been on the drug for that long with my disease. I was first diagnosed in 2016. Being at this end of time, I've been, like 7 years since I was diagnosed, and I'm already beyond the range of what when I read where they say life expectancies are. Oftentimes the mid range would be about 5.5 years. Well, I'm already beyond that. I feel good. I know that a lot of cancer treatments, they only last for a time. And somehow or another, the body adjusts to them and they lose their efficacy. The learning to live with the idea that I had cancer, it took me a while to familiar with the idea that that's what I had. And then through my reading and thinking about it, you just begin to develop a new way. Somehow your mind has to come to terms with it. You can't just have a big open issue like that. And so you a little bit at a time, you resolve that. It really just comes down to it'll be what it'll be, and now but it isn't necessarily what I would like it to be. Cancer is a just a nasty animal. I don't know. I guess we're learning more and more about it all the time, and it's more and more getting to be a condition that can be solved. So one of the things I said about you talked about how I looked at the selinexor, knowing that it's not advertised as a cure, but it seems to be holding me steady enough to that over time, maybe there will be a cure. In fact, I would expect there will be one at some point in time. Somebody will figure something out. And but if I die 2 months before that gets decided, it doesn't do me any good. But this way, at least I give myself a chance to take advantage of new developments that haven't even come into being yet.